All right, just to be mindful of everyone's time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on soil, the ecosystem beneath your feet. My name is Samantha Gentry, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Before today's speaker, there are a few housekeeping things to go over. Your cameras will remain off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. Please type any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A section, and those will be answered at some point during or after the presentation. This presentation will be recorded and will be uploaded to Conservation Nebraska's YouTube page within the next couple of weeks. So if you miss any part of today's presentation, would like to revisit any part, share it with others, you will be able to find it there. Following the presentation, we will have a very brief survey that should take less than a minute to complete. This survey helps support programming like this one, so we appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. If anyone in attendance is interested in speaking with a Conservation Nebraska member regarding conservation issues in Nebraska, or to find out more about what we do, please email info@neconserve.org. I also put that email in the chat. Today, we welcome Dr. Katja Koehler-Cole, the Soil Health Management Extension Educator at the Eastern Nebraska Research Extension and Education Center. And so I will let her take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Samantha. Good morning, everyone. So I will be talking a little bit about soils, what they're made up of, why they're important to us, to food production, of course, to farming, but also to water quality, and also kind of touch on how our understanding of soils as an ecosystem has changed in the past few years. So I would welcome any questions. You can also contact me. I will give my contact information at the end. So what is a healthy soil? I think everybody can kind of take a moment and just think about that. Most of us have, I don't know any of you, but I'm assuming some of you are gardening, some of you may even be farming, but most of us kind of have an idea of what a good soil looks like. Here's some pictures of them. So typically a good soil is darker. It smells like a soil. There's lots of signs of life in that soil, whether that is small critters, earthworms, millipedes, small insects. We typically can't see the most numerous organisms that live on the soil, which would be bacteria and fungi. Those are too small to see, but we can see some signs of their life. For fungi, sometimes we see the little mycelia or, of course, mushrooms. We also want to see a lot of roots in the soil. We Healthy soil is crumbly. You can kind of see that in the pictures pretty well here. It falls apart. It is fairly loose, but it does have a structure to it. And then, of course, healthy soils produce big, healthy, vibrant plants. So we have originally had pretty good soils here in our areas. They were formed on parent material that was to a large extent silt and some clay. We've had thousands and thousands of years of prairies, so grassy plants, few trees, but grassy perennial plants that with deep root systems that really helped build up our soil organic matter and made our soils into the pretty fertile and healthy soils that we used to have here. Some other members or some other creatures that were instrumental in forming our soils were large grazing animals. So there's the pictures of bison here in South Dakota, but they really helped to keep trees out, keep the grass down, and then that grazing also stimulated grass regrowth. So the other thing that was instrumental in forming prairies is really also the work of the first people that lived here, indigenous Native American tribes that would occasionally set fire to the prairies. It was a sort of management of those prairies, but what it did is that it kept the trees out and encouraged plant regrowth. And the intent for the fires was to really have nice, fresh, lush vegetation for bison and elk and other grazing animals. Um, so I think that that's a good reminder that in order to have healthy, fertile soils, we do need vegetation. And it's also beneficial to have other, um, some animals, some grazing animals. Of course, we can't always recreate that, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. There's always an interaction of plants, animals, and then, of course, the abiotic, the non-living organism or the non-living parts of the soil. So some of the world's most productive soils formed under these grasslands. This here is a pasture near Clay Center. Um, Today, of course, it looks a little bit different. Here, most of our prairies have turned into croplands. Um, but in recent years, we really have come to a new understanding of our soils, and we see soils more as an ecosystem. And that in part has to do with the fact that we are realizing our soils, which were formerly very high in organic matter, very fertile, seem to be needing more and more inputs to be at that same level of productivity. And so more and more farmers, gardeners, researchers have come to the conclusion that there's a little bit more to soils than just the minerals and the nutrients, which we are pretty familiar with. And we're trying to really understand what is going on in the soil. So the soil really is an ecosystem, and like all ecosystems, soils have different layers, and every ecosystem starts with plants, right? So we're realizing that having that vegetation, having plants, both shoots and roots, so the above ground biomass is really essential in forming soils. Why? Well, because all other things live off plants, right? And we can't get a lot of organic matter without having a lot of plants. So we're going to start out with the smallest members of the soil food web. So we have bacteria. So bacteria decompose simple organic compounds. They're also important for many cycles. In our context, especially the nitrogen cycle. So bacteria are the most numerous organisms in the soil. They're also the smallest. Um, they really, the other microorganisms that are really important in our soils are fungi. Fungi are also helping to decompose organic, so plant matter and other matter. So again, they also help release nutrients, cycle nitrogen and other plant nutrients back into the soil. Fungi also are very important in aggregating soil, and I will talk more about it in a little bit from an agricultural or even a horticultural point of view. There's two larger groups of fungi that we're thinking about. One of them are the saprophytic fungi, so they're very important in decomposing organic matter. They can decompose the tougher residue. For example, if we're thinking about crops, that would be things such as corn stalks or roots. And then we have our vascular mycorrhizal fungi. They are actually uh, forming beneficial relationships with many of our crops, many of our plants, many of our trees that we're growing. And they really help plants access more water and nutrients in the soil. So there's a lot of these interactive, beneficial relationships going on in the soil. We have a picture here of fungi and bacteria up close. On the left, we have a picture of a vascular mycorrhizal fungi. So Fungi have these long, thin hyphae that grow out into the soil, so they can reach areas of the soil that plant roots that are, too small for plant roots, and they can get into these tiny pores and spaces in the soil and access water or access nutrients such as nitrogen or phosphorus. Bacteria, on the other end, that's the picture on the right here. Bacteria are much smaller, so bacteria also tend to live in some sort of water film on soil particles. So so both bacteria and fungi are the ones that we're thinking about when it comes to decomposing plant residues. So, and again, cycling back all these nutrients into the soil. Um, so we started with plants, roots, and shoots, and we had our bacteria and fungi. But like any other food web, the soil food web also has predators. So we have microscopic predators called protozoa. They eat bacteria. They also, in that process, they release plant or ammonium, which is a plant available form of nitrogen, and they really help keep bacteria numbers down. So seeing some of these predators is a sign of a healthy ecosystem. We have nematodes. Those are slightly larger. Those are multi-cell organisms. Nematodes, we know them, many of us have heard of them as a plant pest, but most of the nematodes in our soils are not pests. Nematodes can eat fungi and bacteria. It kind of depends. They can eat a lot of different things, but they also help keep those populations in check. And in turn, they again release nutrients. And then we have the larger organisms that live in the soil. So arthropods, that would be insects and spiders, earthworms, and small mammals. And they, again, help, or their functions in the soil, again, are to graze plants, graze residue, in the process releasing nutrients. By grazing or sometimes just shredding residue, they don't often consume all of it, but they cannot break it apart. So it's now easier for bacteria and fungi to attach. They eat some of the residue, they poop it out. So they, in that sense, pre-digest residue. Again, that can then be further broken down by bacteria and fungi. So there's a lot of very complex relationships going on in the soil. But the thing to remember is here that we need all these layers. They all start with plants, and we need to have both predators and basically grazers or decomposers in the soil. So that was that piece about the life in the soil. Um, but the other things and that's what we're a little bit more familiar with. I don't know how many of you have a background or have taken classes on soils, but we're more familiar typically with the mineral or the chemical fraction of the soil that has been over the last 100 years or so, that's been kind of the focus of soil science. So we know that soils consist of different minerals, sand, silt, or clay. Usually it's a mix of all of them. Our soils here in eastern Nebraska are often a silty clay loam, so that or silty clay, so they tend to have fairly high amount of clay, some silt. The further west we go in Nebraska, the more sand we have in our soils. So of course, in the sandhills, we have very sandy soils. Clay, especially if you live in an urban environment where our soils are, I just say, not the original ones. A lot of times the topsoil, the good part of the soil has been taken off, and what we're left with is clay. So you're very familiar with clay. It feels sticky when wet. It doesn't infiltrate water very well. Silt is a little bit, silt feels more smooth when it's wet. And then, of course, sand is coarse and gritty. So ideally, we have sort of this mix of clay silt and sand, that's called loam. But we cannot do very much about the texture of our soils. That's just kind of a given. However, we can make all soils better or improve all soils by adding more organic matter. We'll talk a little bit more about this. So, soil texture to a large extent is soil textures, those minerals in the soils. And I wanted to talk or go a little bit more in depth here into what these minerals mean, because that kind of is the basis of, in a sense, how fertile, productive soils can be. So, um, so minerals are all different sizes, and this graph here shows this really well. So sand is our largest mineral that we can find in the soil. We can feel it, we can see it with a naked eye. One sand particle is usually between 0.05 and 2 millimeters. So a millimeter is about, well, less than a tenth, let's say less than a tenth of an inch. So they're fairly small, but when it comes to soil minerals, they are the largest. Then we have silt. It's much, much smaller than sand. And then we have clay, which is so tiny you can only see it with a microscope. What does that mean to how soils function? Well, nutrients in soils, and with nutrients, I mean things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, nutrients, but also organic matter particles. So they all bind to a surface area. Um, the smaller particles, because there's so many of them, have a larger surface area overall, so they can hold more nutrients. So actually our clay soils, which sometimes we complain about this clay, but overall they can hold the most nutrients. They can also hold more water than, say, a sandy soil. That's also why you will find that sandy soils that are really high in sand tend to be poor soils, don't typically have a lot of vegetation. They tend to dry out very quickly. Whereas our silt and clay soils hold a lot more nutrients. They tend to be more fertile. There's usually a lot more vegetation, and they can hold more water. So that is kind of the thing to remember here with the soil texture. Those minerals and the size of the minerals really influence how they function. What else is in the soil? So surprisingly, our soils are 50% actually not soil, not solid. 50% of the soil is either water or air. Because 50% of the soil is made up of pores. That's what we call the spaces in the soil, the spaces that are either filled with air or water. Then the mineral particles are roughly 45%. So that's again silt, clay, loam. And then we have that organic matter. And what all is organic matter? So organic matter is all the living things in the soil. And I like to say it's the living, the dead, and the very dead. So living roots and living microbes, they're part of organic matter. They're organic, derived from organic things. Then, of course, we have dead plants or their residues, meaning dead roots, dead leaves, things like that, and dead microbes in the soil. We have waste products in the soil, so think about manure or just in general the poop from microbes, from earthworms, earthworm casts, all those things. And then we have plants and microbes that are already fairly decayed or decomposed. And organic matter is typically, or in some older text, older publications especially, you will find the term humus, which was kind of meant to describe the very dark part of the soil. We kind of avoid that term. And in recent years, we've come to understand that it's all basically just organic matter, just in varying stages of decomposition. Some are still alive, some are living roots and living organisms, but some are dead and then they're just decomposing. So everything in the soil, all the organic matter in the soil will eventually decompose. Sometimes we say it's all turned over eventually. So why is organic matter so important? Um, Again, thinking back to our prairie soils, which were really, really fertile, those prairie soils had between 5 and 8% organic matter. They were very dark. The reason they're so dark, it's all the carbon in the soil that has a dark color. Nowadays, our soils, even our better soils here in Nebraska, rarely will have more than 3% organic matter. So we've lost a lot of our organic matter. Um, Organic matter in the soil is really uh, the main sign of a healthy soil. Organic matter makes the soil more porous. It helps infiltrate and store water. Just like minerals, organic matter also helps to store water. It houses and feeds microbes. Remember, its microbes constantly need to eat organic things, so they eat organic matter. And the microbes then recycle its nutrients, so they kind of release the nutrients, making them available to plants. Organic matter can also hold nutrients, so nutrients can bind either to organic matter or to minerals in the soil. Again, there's a storage function. And of course, organic matter, it's more than 50% of it is actually just carbon. So that too, when we're thinking about things such as our climate, carbon or healthy soils with a high content of organic matter basically store carbon. But going back to our soil food web, um, having that high amount of organic matter that really, including the living plants and the living roots is really what drives that soil food web. So the more organic matter you have in a soil, typically the richer and more abundant and more diverse your microbial life will be in the soil. Okay, so we talked about texture, we talked about organic matter. Now let's talk about structure. Texture and structure are two different things. Texture is kind of what we've been given. It's the minerals in the soil. But really a good, healthy soil has structure. So these minerals in the soil and the organic matter and the plant roots and the microbes all interact to form aggregates, is what we call these. You could also think about it as the crumbly, soil things. Crumbles in the soil, basically. So these are aggregates. Um, aggregates, a well aggregated soil is one that has a lot of pores, pores of all different sizes, some that are larger, some that are smaller. This graph here shows, how aggregation works at a microscopic level up to a level that we can actually see with the naked eye. So one of these macro aggregates here would be about an eighth of an inch. So again, our minerals in the soil, our clay, silt, and sand particles, they kind of are glued together, and often that is through microbial products. One that you may have heard of is the glomalin, which is a substance that's secreted by fungi. So another reason why we want to have fungi is because they help aggregate soils. They excrete that glomalin. Glomalin kind of binds, because it's kind of a sticky, gluey substance. It binds these particles together. It also binds pieces of organic matter on it. So the fungal hyphae, together with roots, form these smaller aggregates, and then they're formed into, or they're formed into larger and larger aggregates. But even the largest aggregates tend to not be very large at all, so about an eighth of an inch or maybe a little bit larger. So we need living things, we need plants, we need microbes that help bind together the minerals, the non-living things in the soil in order to have good aggregation, to have good soil structure. Um, so again, the structure, what it does, and I have a better picture coming up here, but structure actually allows the soil to have both solid pieces and pores. And the pores are important because that's where water and air move through. So this is a better picture that probably helps to kind of explain how that all works with the soil. So thinking back about the pictures or thinking back to the pictures that I showed in the beginning, where I have a piece of soil that was actually a very healthy, very good soil. It doesn't look like it, but again, 50% of it is just pore space. Pore space can be filled, or can be filled with air, or it can be filled with water. Most of the microorganisms in the soil need air. They're very similar actually to us. Plants don't need air, right? Plants don't need oxygen. We do, so do microbes. They all need oxygen. So we need ways for oxygen or for air to infiltrate into the soil, and that's done through those pores. So plant roots form pores, plant roots and microbes together form aggregates. Between the aggregates, there's some space. Some of it is larger. Sometimes we call them macropores, those larger pores. Macropores can also, for example, be formed by earthworms. An earthworm channel or tunnel can be can turn into a macropore. Roots can also kind of through pushing through the soil, they can kind of lead or form macropores. Then we have medium-sized pores, mesopores, and then we have the really tiny pores. This is actually where a lot of water in the soil will be stored. It will usually be stored in those smaller pores. The larger pores, that's kind of where when we get a rainfall, water will go through the larger pores and just, infiltrate and then make its way through, eventually reaching the groundwater. The smaller pores, they will fill with water. So water can be stored there for a while, until it's used by either microbes or plants. Okay. Good soil structure is really key to maximizing water infiltration, and it has a lot of implications also for water quality. So a well-aggregated soil infiltrates and stores water. So we can see that the top picture here is a well-aggregated soil. We see the pores and we see there's a lot of space between the pores. So raindrop falls on it, and that raindrop can really kind of seep into the soil and eventually also drain out. So we don't get ponding, we don't get standing water. We get water that infiltrates. Some of it is stored, but some of it makes its way into the groundwater. The soil on the that bottom picture there, that could be a compacted soil. We see there's very little pore space, so less of the water will make it through. Another thing that you will get with having soils that have less pore space, you're just not getting that oxygen into the soil. So you often will have, plants that are growing in these soils. If there's a lot of rain, they can actually start rotting because the water can't go anywhere. And there's not enough air exchange. So, yeah. And you'll also have less microbial life because microbes too need that oxygen. So, okay. Um, again, just this is just a good visual again to, show what roots do in our soils, how they help or how they help build our soil structure. I'm not gonna spend too much time on this, but these are basically different cover crop roots that were photographed here. And we can have, different functions here for our soils. But I wanted to take I wanted to take a second to talk about healthy soils and how they lead to cleaner water, because that was part of our talk. So in general, if we have a soil that has good plant life, good vegetation, those plants will take up nutrients in the soil pretty much continuously throughout the year. These nutrients, if they're not taken up by plants, some of them are mobile, especially nitrogen. In its mobile form, it's called nitrate, which is the familiar pollutant in groundwater. Sadly enough, in a lot of Nebraska areas, we have too much nitrate in our groundwater. So nitrate leaching into our groundwater becomes a pollutant. So another reason why we always want to have plants, why we want to have a lot of vegetation, is that to filter out those nitrates, to take up those nitrates. Healthy soils with a lot of microbial life can also degrade herbicides and other chemicals. Okay, I see that a few of my slides are missing. Oh, here they are, actually. Good. Um, so when we're thinking about, we're realizing soil is an ecosystem and there's a whole bunch of living organisms. We tended to think of it more as, okay, they live in the soil particles. They're kind of evenly spread throughout the soil, probably, attaching to the minerals, probably some living in pores. Over the recent years, and this is fairly recent, I would say within the last 15 to 20 years, what we are learning is that it is really roots that are the hotspots for microbial life. So roots um, roots always secrete um, some watery substances. There's always some little bit of sugars. There's some amino acids, so proteins in there. And that is actually where most of the microbes in the soil live. So again, another reason to have plants growing in our soils. Um, so these, the roots, because of those root exudates, provide food, but they also provide habitat to microbes. And I'll explain that a little bit more in detail later, but here's a pretty cool picture. The picture on the bottom, it's an illustration, so it's not a real picture, but this is kind of how we can probably visualize what that would look like in the soil. Again, most of those microbes, and you can see that here are pretty close, living pretty close or very near those plant roots. Okay, so having talked a little bit about the basics of our soils, how we understand the soil ecosystem, how that works, I now want to go and spend the rest of the talk kind of explaining what has changed in our agronomic management over the last few years. And I wanted to first touch on the soil health principles. So we have, again, over the last few years, learning all these things about the ecosystem and the soil, kind of thinking back to how our soils were actually formed, um, so we have realized that there's some principles that should guide how we farm, how we garden, and those are called the soil health principles. And the most important one, and the one that's listed first, is we really need to maximize the presence of living roots. You can also say we need to maximize the presence of living plants. But because we have a winter when most plants are not going to look super alive on the outside, we just say we need to maximize the presence of living roots. Ideally, we have living roots in the ground all year round. That's not always possible, but we're trying to get to that. The second one is minimizing disturbance. And that can be minimizing disturbance from tillage, minimizing disturbance from, say, applying, chemicals, pesticides, or fertilizers. It can also mean minimizing disturbance from, having too much grazing, overgrazing, things like that. The third one is maximizing soil cover. If we have plants growing there year round, we're also maximizing soil cover. So many of those principles kind of overlap. But if we don't have living plants, then at least we should have some sort of other soil cover. You can think about it could be a mulch or something like that. Maximizing biodiversity. We want to have a variety of plants and animals in our systems. And the last principle that was just recently added is knowing your context. So this one is, again, important for farmers, ranchers, gardeners, whoever wants to apply these principles. We need to know our context. Our context can mean the environment that we're growing in, the soils, the soil texture, are we growing on sandy soils or maybe we have a nice silty clay loam. Our weather, the climate where we live is important, but it can also mean things like, what motivates me to be a good steward of my soils. In a farming and ranching context, you can think about things like, do I have what labor do I have? Do I have people that help me? Do I have equipment? You know, Possibly also, what are my markets? Where do I sell to? So knowing your context is a really important thing because some of these soil health principles can be pretty daunting and seem very idealistic, but we all can do a little bit. And I think that is, realizing these are the things that I can actually do with the things that I'm given. That's kind of what, where a lot of this builds around. So um, I will talk about the soil health principles, how we can apply them. I'll give some principles from farming and agriculture in general. And then, since most of you listening in probably are not farmers, but rather maybe have a garden or maybe even just have a small community garden spot, so where else can we apply these principles? So, soil health principles number one: maximize the presence of living roots. So that means planting a cover crop in the off season or fall, a fallow period, um, or else having plants growing there year round. So, but I want to focus a little bit on cover crops because this is where a lot of our farmers here in Nebraska are spending a lot of time and effort. So, cover crops they can be regular crop species, but they always are planted after the main crop is harvested and then they're killed before the main crop is harvested. I shouldn't say always, but in most cases. Cover crops are not harvested. So we don't take the seed. We actually try for them not to go to seed or the residue. So they're not harvested. They're killed and they decompose in place. So the residue really contributes back to having a healthy living soil. So it contributes organic matter and nutrients back into the soil, but they're not harvested. For farmers here in Nebraska, cereal rye is our most common cover crop. That's a picture of it growing in a field of corn. So the corn is obviously harvested. So cereal rye is a very winter hardy cover crop. It is the same species that can also be used to make, it can be harvested for grain and used to make rye bread. But again, as a cover crop, it's not harvested. We just grow it for its leaves and roots, basically. So cereal rye is planted after corn and soybean harvested in the fall. It is very winter hardy, so it will survive our winters. It'll start growing again in early spring. And then it is killed before we plant the next corn or soybean crop. So it is killed in April or May. The residue just stays in the soil, just stays in place. It covers the soil. So here we see a soybean cover crop and the kind of the straw looking stuff that covers the soil surface. That's the cereal rye that has been killed and is now covering the soil and slowly decomposing, returning its nutrients and organic matter back into the soil. Cereal rye residue in soybean, and here it is in corn. So many other benefits to this. We can often think of it as kind of a mulch. Cover crops also help improve water quality. So they're really important, and that's, they've been shown to do a lot of things. Of course, they help prevent erosion. That's initially why we planted them. That's also where the name comes from. A cover crop covers the ground, prevents erosion. However, I would say to a large extent now in Nebraska and other parts of the Midwest, they're grown to take up excess nutrients in the soils because they grow in early spring when there are no other crops in the ground. They actually take up some of that leftover fertilizer the nutrients, especially nitrate, they take that up and prevent it from leaching out and contaminating our groundwater. So many NODs in Nebraska now have cost share programs for farmers to plant cover crops. So house principle, the next one I wanted to talk about is to minimize disturbance, um, reducing or completely eliminating tillage. Actually, Nebraska farmers are doing really well here. Nebraska leads the nation in no-till acres. More than 50% of all farmers do not till the soils anymore. So this is a field, is a cornfield that's actually, this picture here is in early May. And so a soybean crop will be planted into this field within, days or weeks of taking this picture. The soil will not be disked or plowed, nothing like that. Farmers have special planting equipment now that can deal with the residue from the remaining crop. And what this does, of course, it always covers the soil. We're not disturbing that soil structure, those nice aggregates. We're just leaving everything in place. I do want to mention this, that no-till has been made possible, or at least to that extent, because farmers have GMO crops that tolerate herbicide applications, so Roundup ready crops or Liberty ready crops or whatever. There's plenty of these herbicide resistant crops, so farmers use herbicides to kill weeds and not use tillage anymore. So, and that's probably some people think it's one of the downsides of no-till is that we are very reliant now on herbicides. But overall, in terms of soil structure, keeping the soil in place, it really has been a really great way of doing that. Reducing tillage and established garden beds, because we can do that by using a mulch, maybe from grass clippings or wood chips, things like that. We can also use just what we have on hand, which could be compost or leaves. I see that we're kind of running out of time, so I'm gonna be not spending quite as much time talking here, but the next soil health principle is to maximize cover. We can do that with either having plants growing there all the time, including crops and cover crops, or if we don't do that, we need to have some sort of residue or mulch on the soil. So the picture that you see here is actually a cover crop that we planted even before we harvested the corn. You can see the corn stalks, corn has already dried down, so it's close to being harvested. And the farmers here have already planted a cover crop. This one was planted by airplane, so it just the seeds were dropped on the ground and not incorporated, giving the cover crop a little bit of a head start so it can grow in the fall and then overwinter. In a garden situation, we can also plant cover crops. We can leave our residue standing over winter instead of tilling in the fall, or we can use a mulch, like I mentioned earlier. It can be grass clippings, it can be wood chips where that's possible. Yeah. Next one, maximizing biodiversity. I love that. I love to see lots of different plants and having some animals in our systems. This picture is taken at Green Cover. It's a cover crop seed company here in Nebraska, and they really have just a great, huge variety of different species available. They can be used for cover crops. On the right side in that picture here, we see all these flowers. So obviously we would probably not use this as a cover crop, but it's a really cool flowering mix. They just had their field day yesterday and today. So in the future, if you ever are interested, it's an amazing way to spend a morning and check out all these different plants. Plant diversity, that's usually not hard for us who like to garden. We tend to have a lot of diversity. Diversity can mean different species. Within a species, it can mean having different varieties. It can also mean growing both annuals and perennials, even things such as a forest garden or a milpa garden. Animal diversity is a little bit more difficult in our agricultural systems. Unfortunately, we don't really have animals, livestock integrated in most of our farms anymore. but more and more farmers are trying to bring back livestock to graze their fields. So they bring back cattle to graze the fields, even graze their cover crops. This picture here is of a on the right there you see those sheeps and they're grazing a cover crop mix. Um, we can also think about, things such as worms that live in our soils. These are worms that are living in my compost here. I consider them part of my animals in my system, my animal diversity. And then of course, some of us may be able to have some rabbits or have some chickens, herbivores again, that are eating some of that, vegetative matter that is growing, some of the plants that we're growing. And lastly, and I touched on that earlier in the introduction, I really do believe that knowing your context and making that stewardship, making those soil health principles work within your context, that's probably, the basis of everything. So, for me, that's my family, being able to grow healthy food. It's also the people that I work with. And just being able or being able to take care of the land. It can mean different things for everyone. For some, it's faith, communities, things like that. So, you know, applying these soil health principles in the context that matters for you. I think that's where a lot of those things become successful. Okay. Yeah. Lastly, I do want to say building a healthy, thriving food web in your garden or farm takes time, but I think it's well worth the efforts. I wanted to give you some resources here. I have more available. I can also share my presentation with you. Lastly, I wanted to thank you for spending this lunch hour with me. If you have questions, please contact me. My email address is given here. It's kkoehlercol2@unl.edu. And with that, I will answer any questions.
Yeah, and before we get into questions, I'm going to launch the survey really quick. If you could fill it out, it's just 4 questions. Um, Thank you so much, Dr. Koehler-Cole. We do have a question. Um, if you live in southeast Nebraska, what type of soil should you be buying to garden with?
I would ask, why do you not garden in the soil that you have right now? Or are you talking about a potting soil?
I think they mean potting soil.
Okay. Okay. So because, our gardens we are usually able to grow in the soils that we have. If you have your own, garden or yard, I would not necessarily buy a soil. What you can buy is some compost and add that to your existing garden soil. If you're applying compost for the first time, you can probably apply, about 2 to 3 inches. You can kind of try to work that into the soil gently with a hoe, or if you have to with a tiller, but I wouldn't use the tiller too many times. Again, we try to keep the soil structure in place. But that should be all that you need. If you're thinking about, if you have raised beds or things like that, you may have to buy a soil that's specifically made for raised beds. But I think in general, we can work with our soils and build them up over years just with regularly applying compost. And with regularly, I mean, initially, like I mentioned, apply a little bit more, maybe 2 to 3 inches. And then in the next years, maybe apply it every other year and maybe just 1 to 2 inches of compost. I hope
Okay,
that
and
answers the
then
question.
I think so, yeah. And then another question is, what's the difference between humus and compost?
Yeah, so humus was, we don't really use that word so much anymore. Compost is what we make in a compost pile or what, composting facilities make. So we take all that organic matter, the dead plant or living plants, we cut them. Sometimes we can add manure or just use manure. And that's composted in a process that um, it undergoes some changes so that in order for it to be truly called a compost, it actually has to, the temperature has to rise to a certain, temperature for several days. That's what real composting facilities will do, and then it has to be turned, and then the temperature has to rise again to, it's pretty high, it's 140, 150 or even more. So that's a compost. It undergoes a temperature change. The organic materials are broken down. And eventually you end up with something that is nice, dark, crumbly, very fairly lightweight. It's not truly a soil because it doesn't have soil minerals in it. So it is basically just the organic matter. Humus is basically another word for organic matter, but that's built in the soil. But we don't fully use that term so much anymore. We just call it organic matter. But it was that darker portion of the organic matter. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And it looks like that was the last question.
Okay.
And I can send out the presentation. If you want to email it to me, I can attach it to the email. I'll send out an email follow-up after this. I'll also include the recording to this presentation, as well as those resources that are listed on the second to last slide. So yeah, thank you again so much for the presentation, for sharing your time. Thank you to everyone who attended, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye.